thank you all for coming. I'd like to welcome you on behalf of the Africans at Google and BGN. And I feel very honored to be here and to host this rather unique event for Google. My name is Marian Croak, and I'm a VP in the Next Billion User organization, and soon I will be moving into SRE. So before we get started, I just want to give you a couple of announcements. Right after the event, right across the opposite Slice Cafe will be 23andMe Ancestry Kits. And they're for Googlers who are interested in their origins, and especially those of African descent who, in line with the story you're about to hear, want to know more about where they may have descended from. So that's one thing. Second thing, and maybe more importantly, is also right outside will be books, homecoming books, and you'll hear more about the story from Yaa, but you can buy them and she will be available for signing them. And the first 100 Googlers who sign up or who line up for the books will receive one for free. So you have to be quick. But anyway, I want to tell you, I was fortunate enough to read the story. It's beautifully written. It's very painful to read. So sometimes I would actually have to put it aside. But it's a story that needs to be told, and I think all of us need to read it. It helps to understand the underpinnings of the racial complexity and the times that we are living through now. So I would encourage all of you to read it. And I want to tell you a bit about the author, Yaa Gyasi, who's going to join us on stage in a few minutes. She is originally from Ghana, and she's a Stanford alum, and she also graduated from the Iowa, it's very esteemed, the Iowa Writers Program. So we're honored to have her here and blessed to have her here. Her book tells the story of two sisters, Afia and Essie, and they grew up during the 18th century in Ghana, and they lived in two different villages. And Afia is married off to an Englishman and lives in a very palatial castle. But right below her is her sister. And her sister lives in a dungeon right below this castle. And this is where women, it's a women's dungeon. Of course, they also had one for males. And she's imprisoned in this dungeon and is eventually given over to people that put her on a ship and send her off to America to be sold into slavery. And this book, this beautifully written book, tells the story of these two sisters and their descendants over a 300-year period. So it goes through the wars in Ghana over slavery. It then takes us to the war in America over slavery, to the coal mines in the deep South where many of the freed slaves had to work, and then to the Great Migration North, and to the 20th century Renaissance in Harlem, to the present day. And it's an amazing, amazing journey, and I think we're still on that journey, as you know. But I would encourage you all to please read the book because it really helps give you insight into what's going on inside ourselves and inside this country and across the world. Joining Yaa on the stage will be two Googlers who are descendants of African origin, and one is Bash, and he shares the same lineage as Afia. And the next one is Kanika, and she shares the lineage of Essie. and they will join Yaa in a conversation, and you're all invited to participate in that conversation as well. So please join me and welcome them to the stage.
Hi everyone, it's so exciting to see this room almost full. We're very excited about that. Thanks to everyone for coming, and I'm so excited to see I told, as she walked up earlier, I was like, okay, I think I'm a little starstruck. So, just before we get into the conversation everyone's excited to have about the book, I think it's important for us to just learn more about Yaa. So that's actually where we're going to get started.
Okay.
Can you give us a little bit more context about yourself? We know you moved here when you're little to Huntsville, Alabama, but tell us a little bit about the story of Yaa.
So I was born in Ghana, in Mampong, and then my family moved when I was 2 to America. And we first moved to Ohio. My father was getting his PhD at Ohio State in French, and he's a French professor. And then kind of as he was looking for a tenure-track job, we moved a lot. So we lived in Ohio first, and then Illinois, Tennessee, and then Alabama. And we moved to Alabama when I was 9. And I stayed there until 18 when I left to come to Stanford. And then after that, I took a year off between college and grad school, and I went to graduate school at the University of Iowa at the Writers' Workshop. So which is where I wrote most of Homegoing.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Thank you. And Kanika?
So, yeah, I'm just thrilled to be up here with you. So thank you again.
Yeah.
So I think between Bash and I, we have probably seen every interview you've done, every article you've written about you, and read a few of the articles you've written yourself. And so we know that you've wanted to be a writer since you were young. Mm-hmm. We're curious, what is it that you would be doing if you weren't a writer?
Oh man, I don't know what I would be doing if I weren't a writer. I really hadn't thought of any other career that I wanted to do. I mean, I sang growing up. Actually, one of the people that I used to sing with is in this room, Adam Seaton. And so I think for a brief period of time, I thought that I wanted to be a singer, but that felt like completely unattainable. And if you can believe it, writing felt like the more stable career choice to go for. So that's what I decided.
Not the startup that you worked at?
No.
No? When we saw that, we were like, well, Google's kind of a startup-ish with 70,000 people.
Very different.
Still trying to preserve that startup culture, but
yeah.
I know that you were at a startup. For those of you who don't know, I think, was it right after college?
It was right after college,
okay.
yeah.
And it doesn't sound like that worked out. I was just curious.
No,
why
I mean,
that wasn't a good match.
like went into it knowing that I was just taking a year off between college and grad school, so I wasn't, I didn't feel like I was there to stay.
Got it.
And I think I only ended up being there for 8 months.
Okay.
And I left and started working on the writing that I would be doing once I got to graduate school.
Awesome. For anyone in the room that's familiar with African parents, singing and writing sound like very hard sells. Like, I think my mom is in here, but I shouldn't say. I felt like I had 3 options growing up. I was going to be a doctor, an engineer, a lawyer. That's it.
Yeah.
So how did that go about at home?
It didn't go over well. I mean, I have to say, I guess my parents encouraged me in that, you know, my dad's a professor and he teaches French and Francophone African literature, and so books were always in our house and a part of our lives, and reading was always a part of my life. And so that part wasn't really a surprise to them at all. But then suddenly, I think when I started to vocalize that that was what I wanted to do with my life, was become a writer, I faced some resistance, I would say. And really, I think freshman year of college was when it kind of came to a head. I think I was like fighting with my mom basically every day about what I wanted to do with my life and what I wanted to be. Which I understand, you know, you come to America, you sacrifice so much, and you've made this like very deep investment in your children, and so if they tell you that they, you know, they don't think that this path that you've kind of started them on is the one that they want to go on themselves. I think it can be really scary for them. But now they both have amnesia about that whole period in our lives. Yeah.
So what was the tipping point? I think there's a lot of wonderfully talented folks in the room that may be passionate about writing or singing or doing something. What was the tipping point to help gain that support from family? Stop the fighting, essentially.
I mean, it was really just kind of saying that there was nothing else that I wanted to do. I think once they saw how unhappy I had been in any other kind of path in that startup, I think that they realized that I was very serious when I said that this was what I wanted to do, and started to kind of take me seriously at that point. But you do have to kind of, I guess, be willing to say, this is a line and I'm not going to cross it. You know, if either you can come with me on this journey or not. And that's kind of hard to do when you're young and still kind of feeling out whether or not you can make it in the world of art, which is a difficult world to get your feet in.
To get into. That's perfect.
So to quote someone who shall remain nameless, I heard someone say, Yaa's hair is always on fleek. And I agree. And I was just curious, you know, as an African-American woman, I think we always grapple with, you know, how am I going to wear my hair? Am I going to wear it straight? Am I going to wear it natural? If I wear it natural, you know, what am I going to do with it? And how are people going to receive it? Curious about your inspiration behind the different hairstyles that you have.
Oh, I've never gotten that question before. I went natural about 3 years ago, I guess. And I'm one of those people who had never seen her natural hair. Like, my mom slapped a relaxer into my hair when I was like 5, and so I didn't even know what my hair looked like growing out of my head. And so I think I was just in graduate school, and I felt like I had the time to figure out how to take care of it myself. And so I just chopped it all off and started this natural hair journey. I don't know if I have inspirations for my hairstyle. At this point, I'm traveling so much that it's just whatever is easy and fast and will kind of last me a long time. So I do it about once a week. I wash it and twist it out, and that's all that I do.
I think we can all relate to that.
Yeah.
And you know, I'll add on to that. Anybody who's been at Google long enough knows about maybe every month, there's an email that goes out to the Black Googler Network, BGN, that says, hey, I just moved to the Bay Area. Where can I get my hair done?
Yeah. Yeah.
So if you want to share, if you have any good spots in the Bay Area that you'd like to recommend and give a shout out to, we welcome that.
No, I can't remember where I used to get my hair done when I was in college, but I definitely sent that email a few times. I think I would even kind of look up pictures of people whose hair I liked on campus, and then email them and ask where they'd been getting their hair done. Yeah, it's kind of a desperate situation out here.
Yes, thanks.
I love that targeting. We need to start doing that with BGN. Gotta get that list with pictures. Let's switch gears for a sec and dive into the book. Tell us a little bit about the inspiration, where this started. You went back home sophomore year.
Yeah.
Let's hear a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so when I was at Stanford my sophomore year, I received a fellowship called the Chapelugee, and they give it to sophomore students to complete a research or creative-based project the summer between sophomore and junior year. And I knew that I wanted to use mine in order to research a novel. And initially, I'd had a different idea in mind. I thought I wanted to write a book about a mother and her daughter. And so I thought it would be nice to go to my own mother's hometown, which is Abakrumpa in the central region of Ghana, and just kind of see if anything struck me, if any inspiration happened, which is not the right way to approach accepting a large sum of money to do research. But thankfully, a friend came to visit, and we ended up going to the Cape Coast Castle. And it was my first time there, and kind of my first time really And it was while at the castle that I took the tour, and it was a really kind of popular tour at that point because Obama's family had just been there, I think, a week before me, so a lot of people were kind of flocking to the castle. And the tour guide kind of just took us around, and he started to talk to us about how the British soldiers who lived and worked in the castle used to marry the local Ghanaian women, which was something I had never heard before, and really fascinated me. And I wondered about the lives of those women and how they could possibly kind of be, walking around free above these captives, because the next thing that the tour guide did was to take us down into the dungeons. And I don't know if they do this in every tour, but they close the door so you can see how dark and how small it is, and there's just like a little ring of light. And so I just was immediately struck by that juxtaposition, the idea of this upstairs, downstairs thing. And I knew immediately that I wanted to write about that place in some capacity. I didn't exactly know what it would look like or how long it would take or anything like that. I think it was maybe the first time in my writing life where I felt anything like a stroke of inspiration. I just knew that I wanted to write about this place.
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
So Marian gave us a lovely, I think, setup and overview of the book, but I want to dig a little bit deeper and set up the context for us. Tell us a little bit about what was going on in history at the start of the book.
So the book starts with these two half-sisters, Afia and Essie. Afia is born into this Fanti village, and she's kind of the daughter of a relatively powerful man, not an incredibly powerful man, but her village chief decides that their village is going to become a part of facilitating the slave trade. So they're going to kind of be a stop on this road from the inland to the coast. And meanwhile, her family's also thinking about who to marry her to because she's coming of age, and they ultimately end up more or less giving her away in this marriage to the British governor of the Cape Coast Castle, which was the kind of seat of British colonial power in Ghana during that time period. And so she ends up moving to the castle, living there. Seems like she has a relatively good life, loves her husband, loves her kid, but at the same time is somewhat aware of something very nefarious that is happening below her, which is Essie's story. Essie, the second half-sister, is an Ashanti. She's born to a very powerful warrior who lives in the inland area in what was then called the Gold Coast, present-day Ghana. And her father kind of has led her village into all of these battles, and they've won, and things are looking up for them until some other rival ethnic group comes to kind of pay retribution, and in this a bunch of her people are captured and then marched down to the coast, and she ends up being sold into slavery. And so the novel never tells you whether they intersect it at the exact same period, but you get the sense that Afia is living above her sister at one point. And so then you follow down the line, descendant after descendant, into the present day.
Are you guys getting a feel for the book? It's amazing. And I mean, that was just the first maybe 2 chapters,
yeah,
maybe?
The first 2
and
chapters.
There are 15 chapters, I think, altogether. And this book has everything that you can get elsewhere, all the drama that you're seeing. I mean, it addresses homosexuality, polygamy, people cheating on their husbands, and being a single parent, just so much. And for me as a woman, there were a lot of things that I felt impacted women in particular. And so I was just curious for you, what emotions did this bring out in you in writing this book, particularly as it relates to the women in the book and what they experienced?
I always knew that I wanted women to be very central to the book. I mean, women are kind of central to my life. I've heard a writer say, people ask her, why are there so many strong women in your novels? And she said, well, I don't know any weak women, and that's kind of how I feel about that subject. This book, because I knew it was going to be multi-generational, I knew that I wanted to start with women in particular because my people, the Akans, are matrilineal, and so it felt like an appropriate way of kind of setting up a family to start with this matriarch, the mother of these two sisters, and then just kind of move down in that way. But it is equal in that half of the chapters are narrated by men and half of them are narrated by women. But I do think that that I guess my interests kind of my interests lay with the idea that women were oftentimes the backbones to these families, and kind of exploring what that meant as we moved down the line.
I feel like I'm bogarting. Do you have a question you want to ask?
Yeah.
Okay, go for it.
Yeah. Thanks, Kanika.
You're welcome.
I think for me that was a very powerful visual to go through the first portion you were talking about around these women in these very two different parts of the castle. I feel like if I ever visit the Cape Coast Castle, without giving away any spoilers, I might be looking for something. But so much of the book felt amazingly real. How did you bring that to life? I was Wikipediaing and Googling, like as I was doing this, like, wait, is that real? Was that governor really there? And
Yeah.
these were facts that you built stories around. How did you manage to do that without being overwhelming as you went through it?
Well, I was overwhelmed every day, so I don't know if I actually managed to do it without being overwhelmed. I knew kind of going in that it was going to take a lot of research, but the way that I approached it was I made a family tree at the very beginning of the process, and it looks a lot like the one at the front of the book now, except mine also had the dates that each chapter would take place in, and then something that was happening politically, historically in the background during each time period. So for Kojo's chapter, it was the Fugitive Slave Act. For Akuya's chapter, it was the Asantwa War, and that kind of just helped me figure out a starting point for the research. And then I would spend a little bit of time researching whatever that thing was, and then the time period, and just enough to make me feel as though I had kind of entered the world of the character, because I think sometimes when you read historical fiction, you start to feel like the book is just like stiff with research, and it stops feeling as though it's about the story, and I wanted to always kind of privilege the story. And so I say if I ever came to this crossroad where I had to decide between something that was true and something that was good for the story, I would choose the thing that was good for the story, which not every writer would make that choice, but I did want it to be kind of a pleasure to read, for lack of a better way of putting it. So I wrote it chronologically, just kind of using that family tree as a guide, and trying to remember to focus on character first.
And that comes through powerfully in the structure of the book. While Kanika and I were preparing for this, so I cheated a little bit. I had the audiobook as well as the actual book. And I was listening to it, and I was saying, oh, you gotta check out chapter 14 or whatever. And she's like, dude, there are no chapters in the book. It's just people's names. That was a very ambitious structural choice. Had you seen that before? What's the story behind that?
So the structure came about probably about 3 years into the writing process. When I first started the book in 2009, I had a much more traditional structure in mind. I thought that I wanted to write something that would be set in the present and then just flash back to 18th century Ghana. And so if you've read the book, kind of the first two characters and the last two characters were the ones that I wanted to focus on. But then the longer I worked on it, the more that started to feel, just kind of not significant enough. I wanted to be able to kind of watch this through line, be able to watch things like slavery and colonialism shift really gradually over this very long period of time. And so I realized that aspect, the aspect of time, was the most important thing to me. And in order to capture that, I felt like I needed to be able to stop in as many generations as possible so that it was clear to me and to the reader, how these things came from those things, which came from those things, which came from those things. And so you kind of see this domino effect effect of history as you move, and I didn't think I could do that if I just had a book that was set in the present and flashed back. And I've seen a lot of other multi-generational novels before, a lot of which I love, but I knew that the particular challenge of Homegoing was that I was never going back in time, so I was never returning to a character. Each chapter moves forward in time, and you never, you'll hear bits and pieces about a character through their descendants, but you never have a chapter that returns to the descendant. So that aspect of it was probably the hardest thing to figure out how to do.
Awesome.
Do you want to get to why we're here?
Yeah, I don't know if I'm ready for it though. It gets a little intense.
Yeah.
One of the things that this book spurred for me, and as we got together and started planning this event and to bring you, to ask you to join us here, was the juxtaposition of what the impact has been. So Afia and Essie, if they met at a village party, whatever it would be, would have had a particular set of interactions. But as you go through, you see their descendants,
Right.
and those interactions are not there. So we're hoping that to get us started with like this section, you'd read a little bit from the book.
Sure.
And there are no spoilers here, guys, so don't worry. And just the highlighted portion from the bottom to here.
Cool. The next day, Marjorie sat by herself, reading Lord of the Flies for English class. She held the book in one hand and a fork in the other. She was so engrossed in the book that she didn't realize that the chicken she had pierced with her fork hadn't made it into her mouth until she tasted air. She finally looked up to see Tisha and the other black girls staring at her. "Why you reading that book?" Tisha asked. Marjorie stammered, "I have to read it for class." "I have to read it for class," Tisha mimicked. "You sound like a white girl. White girl. White girl." They kept chanting, and it was all Marjorie could do to keep from crying. In Ghana, whenever a white person appeared, there was always a child there to point him out. A small group of children, dark and shiny in the equatorial sun, would extend their little fingers toward the person whose skin was different from theirs and shout, "Obroni, Obroni." They would giggle, delighted by the difference. When Marjorie had first seen children do this, she'd watched as the white man whose skin color had been told to him grew shocked, offended. "Why do they keep saying that?" he'd asked the friend who was showing him around. Marjorie's father pulled her aside that night and asked her if she knew the answer to the white man's question, and she had shrugged. Her father had told her that the word had come to mean something entirely different from what it used to mean, that the young of Ghana, itself an infant country, had been born to a place emptied of its colonizers. Because they didn't see white men every day the way people of his mother's generation and older had, the word could take on new meaning for them. They lived in a Ghana where they were the majority, where theirs was the only skin color for miles around. To them, to call someone Obroni was an innocent act, an interpretation of race as skin color.
Awesome. You wrote a really powerful article for the New York Times, and the headline was, "I'm Ghanaian-American, Am I Black?" As you go through that piece about the character, how much of that was a personal experience you had growing up, and how have you interpreted your identity as both Afia and Essie since you were born in Ghana and you moved over to Alabama?
Yeah, I mean, I think that little interaction where Marjorie gets made fun of for reading was something that had actually happened to me, not exactly like that, but similar to that, and it was really confusing. And I think most of my kind of trying to figure out identity, specifically racial identity in America when I was young, was about being confused. I think in part because my parents didn't really connect to it in the way that I did. I always say if you come from a country where everybody looks like you and you aren't kind of used to thinking of yourself as Black, it can be a challenge to come to America and have to start to kind of learn the racial rules. And so if somebody said something offensive or used an epithet to me, and I came home and told my parents about it, they'd be like, well, they're not talking about you. But of course they were, and I think they didn't like really realize how that worked. They obviously had different kinds of divisions, like my mother's a Fanti and my father's an Ashanti, and that was a division. But the division of you know, white and Black was one that they didn't really understand. And so in a lot of ways, I felt like I kind of had to, me and my brothers had to kind of figure things out on our own, which was a challenge.
What percentage of Marjorie would you say was you? That seemed to be the closest character.
Yeah, I think Marjorie and Marcus, the last two characters, are the most similar to me. They're obviously the closest in time period to me, so it's kind of easier to relate to them. Marjorie, I think, shares the most kind of biographical information. You know, she's born in Ghana, but she's raised in Alabama. But I think where she starts to veer off is that she has a much more intimate, deeper relationship with Ghana than I did. She goes back every summer to visit her grandmother. I only went back twice. So her connection to her homeland is a lot stronger than mine was.
So it's interesting that you talk about your experiences, or even Margaret's experiences in growing up, and not necessarily, and particularly your parents, not necessarily identifying with Black Americans or African Americans.
Yeah.
There was one particular passage in your book. It was in the Marjorie chapter, and it was her teacher, Miss Pinkston. And she said, here in this country, it doesn't matter where you came from first, to the white people running things. You're here now, and here, Black is Black is Black. And that resonated with me because growing up in the States, being born here and growing up here, you know, I've never seen myself any different from any other Black person, whether you're from Africa or the Caribbean. So it always baffles me when I am in spaces where people who I consider to be Black separate themselves and consider themselves to be different than. So Bash and I talked about this and had some very interesting conversation. I think he had a different perspective, obviously growing up outside of the States and coming in, but do you want to share?
Yeah. I think that's one of the things that we wanted to understand and unpack for everyone in the room is externally, right? As you come into work, whether you're, at Google or wherever, you walk into the room, you're Black, right? And all the assumptions that go with that Blackness, that's what's expected, right? So. As their field line as born and raised Nigerian, when I come in, if my accent gets stronger in the meeting, it's a little bit of a surprise for folks. And one of the things that we've been trying to understand is that when you put these Kanika and myself, when you put these different types of Black in the same space, the connection isn't as tight as we might expect. And what do you think is the cause for that, and how do we begin to unpack and bring that closer?
Yeah, I think partially the cause is, so in Homegoing, you're looking at this family that doesn't recognize that it's a family and can never recognize that it's a family. There have been these ruptures, these divisions, to the point where members, particularly on the African American side of things, can't even recognize which country from the continent they've been ripped from, and that to me is kind of devastating. That these ruptures exist, and so I think part of it, speaking mostly just for the African side, is just recognizing that fact that there is this connection that exists, even if you have to go back a long time to get to the source of that connection, it does exist, and to kind of stop thinking about yourselves as necessarily separate from Black Americans, because I think that's where a lot of the kind of troubles navigating race begin for African immigrants, is this idea that we are necessarily different, set apart. But in terms of how to go about that, I don't know. I don't know if I have a good answer for that.
Yeah.
Really difficult question.
That is the ongoing question. And we're going to switch into live questions soon and live comments. So I encourage folks that have an opinion about that. That's the conversation we're trying to get started today. And that's why the ancestry portion of the event has been introduced, right? So we get a chance to actually go back as far as we can to the beginning of our story, right? And start to connect these two communities. Just as a quick show of hands, how many people in the room knew there was any sort of gulf between the Black American community and the African community? Okay, so we have like 20, 25% or so. So for the rest of y'all, surprise. These are conversations that we're having that we're trying to bring to this, using Yaa's platform for us to start discussing. When it comes to the healing, we know that's a very, very hard thing. Like you said, the answer to that question is something that the community needs to come together to talk about. But there's a portion in your book, I think, we weren't sure we were going to have time for this, so Kanika's going to be very excited, that speaks about regret and how to deal with regret. Do you recall what I'm speaking to? No,
I don't know if I know exactly what
Okay.
you're
The
talking
father,
Perfectly.
a father and a daughter. The crops did not
Right.
manifest.
Right,
And
if in the moment of
the
doing,
girl was
you felt
crying, and the
clarity.
father was saying,
Yeah.
you don't need to regret. And I don't know the exact, oh, there we go.
So here we go. Since we have a little bit of time.
Sure.
So for us, we've like studied this. This is like the Bible at this point.
It was a long time ago that I
Yeah.
wrote this book. The plants have all died, and I could have helped them, she said between sobs. Abena, he said, what would you have done differently if you knew the plants would die? She thought about this for a moment, wiped her nose with the back of her hand, and answered, I would have brought more water. Her father nodded. Then next time, bring more water, but don't cry for this time. There should be no room in your life for regret. If, in the moment of doing, you felt clarity, you felt certainty, then why feel regret later?
That moved us
Yeah.
as we thought about where these two communities are now. And in a way, we felt like in present day, the Marcus and Marjorie, the Kanika and the Bash, we're the new crop. So our choice is how to deal with the regret of what's happened to us.
Right.
And with that said, folks, we'll open it to live questions if people can start lining up by the mics for folks with questions. And I will also get the dory ready.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. So just for transparency, I'm Haitian, so I'm Caribbean, and I feel kind of like on the sidelines, like watching this happen, right? Because it's one of those things where I grew up knowing I'm Haitian, born here in America, but then also like that kind of divide that you talk about, but then also knowing that like even further back, there's this like ancestry from Western Africa, most likely, right?
Right.
But what I also realized is growing up, especially kind of just after this weekend and after the tragic shooting of Jordan in Dallas, a young boy who was killed over the weekend. It's, for me personally, I just wonder, there's so much harm in not seeing kind of the fact that at any one point, those stories don't appear, right, as our skin color does, right? And so those stories kind of get erased under the guise of this blackness and whatever stereotypes people might have of you, right? Law enforcement, what have you. But my question is what do you think is the benefits of these communities coming together, right? What power do you think we might have in a collective by understanding the very real situation that there is in this country of walking in America as a Black woman, as a Black man. And so I just love to hear kind of your dreams for what that connection might be.
Yeah, I mean, I think, aside from healing, which I shouldn't set that aside because that's a really important factor, right? The ability to kind of heal. But it's an opportunity to kind of protect one another as well. What you were saying really resonated with me. I was in that essay that I wrote for the New York Times, I talked about this situation that my little brother had gotten into where he was riding his bike in our neighborhood when we live in a predominantly white neighborhood in Alabama, and our new neighbors called the police on him. And the police came and kind of sent him home. And you're thinking, this situation could have gone so differently. And my little brother can't go home and just tell, or can't tell these police officers that he's Ghanaian, he's not Black. So that kind of position doesn't work in the outside when you leave your house. It doesn't work. And so the part of the reason why this community does need to come together is, I think, for protection, for healing, for kind of being able to stick up for one another, and kind of, put a better face forward for all of us.
This is going to be a bit of a loaded question, but you alluded to earlier people reaching back into the past and seeing where they're from and all that, the experience of getting to know oneself through that avenue. But the past itself is both very fragmented because there's this idea of romanticizing pre-colonial past as if it was some ideal situation where everyone kind of got along when there was clearly like a lot of infighting and migration. And that's complicated more so by the fact that there was very few remnants of that time in place in the world after colonialism, because most people's experience with their culture, especially words I know in Southern Africa, for example, come from a lot of the 60s, 70s, and 80s, especially in South African culture, for example. So to you, what's the experience of culture and what is the utility of that culture in self-identification from your perspective?
I think one of the big challenges for writing Homegoing, particularly for those earlier chapters, was just how little research I could get my hands on from the perspective of the people who had been going through these things. All of the accounts that I was reading, there was a really helpful book called The Door of No Return by William St. Clair that took you through the Cape Coast Castle, and it had a chapter on the women, it had a chapter on the children, but what was noticeably absent was any kind of chapter on slavery and what was happening in the bottom of this dungeon. And so I think one thing that we are offered now is the opportunity to kind of develop these voices through fiction. For me, I can only speak, I guess, for my own medium, but it kind of gave me the opportunity to lend a voice and kind of create this, create a presence in a place that had once been absent. And I think that even though it's fictional, I think that does kind of help to kind of reestablish a culture that has been lost and a culture that has been erased, and give an opportunity to kind of see one way to kind of restore something.
I think one of the things that brings up for me and for Kanika and I as we went through this experience together, like I was saying, the book was a little bit of group therapy from the two different angles, but African slave traders is something you don't hear a ton about. Mm-hmm. And Kanika, if you don't mind me sharing, she was saying that she read that there was a lot of anger.
Yeah.
And she asked me quite candidly, like representing the African side, do you feel shame? Like what? And one of the questions I think that bubbles up for me is, what level of responsibility do you feel, and one of the characters speaks to this, but I'm just curious, what level of responsibility do you feel like the African community should inherit and discuss and take for how these stories have played through?
Mm-hmm. I mean, I guess first of all, just the acknowledgement that this happened is very important. It's something that, I'd heard about, but people kind of mostly talk about it in whispers. It wasn't something that I had heard people talk about really explicitly until I went to the Cape Coast Castle. And the tour guide wasn't trying to keep it a secret. It wasn't like he was hiding this information. If you take the tour, they'll talk to you about the different roles that the different ethnic groups had played in this. And yet, I feel like there's this tendency to really bristle if you mention it among people that I've met. And I think that reaction is the wrong one. How can you take responsibility if you won't even acknowledge that it happened at all? And so I think that's kind of the first thing that needs to happen.
Awesome. Thank you.
First of all, I just want to thank you for even writing this book. I think it sounds really exciting, and I'm looking forward to reading it. And thank you for being here today. And for the organizers, thank you for putting this together. As a man of African descent who doesn't know what part of the continent I'm from, I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about that and not have to pay at least $100 for that opportunity. My question is, do you have any ideas or inspiration for what your next project or your next book might be? I'm kind of at the beginning of a new novel. I'm really superstitious about talking about what I'm working on, so I won't get too into it, but I think it'll be set in the present, mostly because I don't want to do as much research. And I've heard other writers talk about how you only really have 3 things that you ever really write about in your career, and you just kind of circle those things. So I think a lot of the themes that I'm fascinated with and a lot of my obsessions will continue to appear in my work from now on.
When can we expect it?
It's a
No
great
pressure.
question. It's a really great question.
We'll all be eagerly anticipating the arrival of it.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
My mother and I read this book together, and we absolutely loved it. I was struck by your imagery of the dominoes of the Black experience, the African experience in America. And there were so many dominoes, the passing, the unionization, there's just so much. Is there anything that you wanted to include, but you just couldn't pack it into the book? Is there anything or any additional characters or instances or moments in Black history that you just couldn't fit in that, didn't make it, got cut out?
It didn't get cut out, but the most noticeable absence, and the thing that people often talk to me about, is that I don't write about the Civil War at all. So the Civil War kind of acts as the division between parts 1 and parts 2 of the novel. And that was mostly because I felt like it was a good kind of halfway mark, and I felt like we all kind of know about it, and I also just didn't feel like I had a good Civil War story in me to contribute. So that's probably the biggest thing that got left out of the book.
Thank you. I grew up in Ghana. Lived there for 13 years, and I went to the castle when I was 12. Didn't really have that much of an impact on me. I grew up as a refugee in Ghana, for that matter. But there were claws on the walls. I think the room that you mentioned with the circle, I still have vivid memories of that. And they said, the slaves were fighting each other, eating feces, and scratching the walls just for air and light. So that really, kind of struck me just now. But at the same time, I moved to the U.S. when I was 15, and unlike most African stories that I've heard, I was excited to meet other Black people here because I didn't have any clue. I just saw the music videos, and I thought they were just cool as hell. But my first day of school, I wore a kente, like my kente, like my most prized outfit.
Yeah.
And I wore sandals and went to school and got clowned on, right? I was the darkest kid in the school. I didn't look like anybody. I wasn't cool enough. And so growing up unconsciously, I fought the assimilation, right? I sound different from my family. All my family sound African. I sound like this. Some people recognize that I'm African later. And so it's like, what advice do you have for, I guess, the Black community when there are people like myself looking to learn about them, but yet we face this hostile, negative and almost life-changing experience that is still affecting me today.
Mm-hmm. I think that's for Kanika and Yaa and folks that want to speak to it. It just got real, y'all. Thank you.
I will let our guest go first.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I mean, I think part of the reason that I wanted to write Homegoing in the first place was because I had kind of always felt this this sense of not being, at least for me, not being Ghanaian enough for Ghanaians and not being Black enough for Black Americans. And where did I stand? If I couldn't be either of those things, what did that make me? And I think that was something that I grappled with a lot when I was younger. And those questions about identity, both racial identity and ethnic identity, were the ones that were kind of propelling me to think about not the divisions, but the connections. And so this book was an opportunity for me to do that, but I don't know, but that was like just a personal kind of therapeutic thing that I did, and I don't know how to extend that out for other people. I don't know. Do you have?
I think this is going to sound very prescriptive, but I think it's about education and exposure. And clearly the people who came across you when you came here, they had very limited exposure and had certain preconceived notions in their heads as to what you were wearing, what you looked like, and what that represented and what that meant. And so I think everyone in this room and beyond this room, we need to start taking opportunities wherever we can to educate those around us, to educate those who come after us, those who have come before us who have these preconceived notions in their heads, and expose them. And so, part of it is what we're doing right now. As I look around the room, I see many different races and cultures, and for me, it's about learning, and I would presume that for many of you, it's about learning and creating more understanding as well.
I think that goes both ways too,
Exactly.
because I had certainly heard things from West Africans in my life that were totally inappropriate and unacceptable that they had said about Black Americans. And I think it's kind of beginning to call out those things when you see it, so that, especially when it's happening to impressionable children, that they don't start to internalize that and believe those things about themselves, not just about themselves, but about their classmates, about their friends. And so, I mean, that's one thing you can do when you see it in your own life, is just to call it out.
I think pretty much everyone has to read Homegoing. It kind of solves the problem. It starts this conversation for a lot of folks. And like Yaa just said, I think it goes both ways. Augustine just shared his experience, but I'm sure there might be one or two people in this room that can share experience from the Black American point of view and experiences they've had with Africans. And one of the key reasons we're doing this is to celebrate Africa Day. Africa Day, little known day, or a holiday, so to speak, that we're trying to start to mark. And what it marks is the creation of the African Union. So when you look at history, you actually realize the emancipation of Black people, regardless of what continent they were on, all kind of dominoed at the same time. And as I did research for this, I realized that MLK was actually in Africa in '57, meeting with one of the leaders of the African Union. I can just imagine what that connection was like. Back then, they saw each other as brethren fighting for a single goal, right? What happened in the last 50 years, right? And I think that's a challenge for us in the room, in this community, to say, this is Google. What we do here spreads out into the world. And if we can take this challenge on and take us back to whatever MLK was thinking as he sat down in the room with the founders of the African Union, it could be something truly special and truly powerful. With that said, we have about a minute, so we'll take one last live question, and then we'll get instructions on the next portion of the event.
Thank you. Two quick comments and a question. First comment, thank you for the organizers who put this incredible event together to introduce me as an African, as a native-born Ethiopian who didn't know about your book or your work, so we'll be diving in. Second comment, I'm incredibly privileged to actually experience this day today with my dad, who happens to be visiting and in town. And I get a quick question for you with regard to the appropriateness of handing this book and being able to have my 10 and my 12-year-old son and daughter be able to read it, because you have many times told my story of coming to this country with a foreign background and an accent that drives people crazy because you can't place it anywhere and it takes the shape of its surrounding very quickly. Just wanted to kind of get your feedback on how would you pass this on to a young preteen who I really want to expose some of this work to and bring the awareness to.
I think it would be age appropriate for a middle school child, maybe not younger than that, but middle school and up, I think could definitely read it. And I think, I mean, I've said this before, I feel very much like this is the book that I wanted to read when I was that age and did have all of these questions about identity and race and ethnicity. And so I think, yeah, if I had had a book like this when I was younger, it might have helped make some things easier as I move through. So I hope that you do share it with your children, and thank you for that comment.
Awesome. Can we just celebrate Yaa for a second, please? All right, folks, so part 2. For folks that are interested in the ancestry test, you're going to have to exit this way because we have another diversity event happening behind us that you should join once you're done. But you're going to exit this way. And right opposite Slice Cafe, the wonderful volunteers are already there waiting for you to get started with that portion of the event. For people interested in the book, and people are booking it. For people interested in the book vendor is going to be outside as well. Thank you again, everyone, for joining us. Appreciate it.